Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, Maria Fedoryka. She is professor of philosophy at Ave Maria College in Ave Maria, Florida, and her work has centered very much around man and woman, human love and sexuality. She will speak to us today on von Hildebrand's philosophy of community, and she's going to try to dig into the heart of his philosophy of community, exploring the role of value in binding people together in community. She's also been a close associate of the Hildebrand Project and is now an associated scholar with us, and we look forward to ever more collaboration with Maria Fedoryka. Maria?
So good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here this morning. I'm very excited to talk to you about what I have been calling the nuts and bolts of community according to Dietrich von Hildebrand, as found in his book, Metaphysics of Community. So I just want to give a few random introductory remarks, but you all should have a handout, and it's an outline of the talk today, and also it has some of the most important quotes and the longer quotes so you can follow along. So I kind of want to ask you not to look ahead, because the first time I was reading this work, it actually felt like a philosophical thriller. Because Dietrich von Hildebrand doesn't begin in the obvious place when he's talking about community. Now, we're going to be talking about community in the narrow sense. So in other words, not any association is called a community in the narrow sense. It's going to have a kind of a strict meaning for von Hildebrand, and we're going to explore how it's formed. But he denies that community is based solely on the interpersonal relationships. So you have somebody like Edith Stein, who she dives into the question of community by beginning with interpersonal relationships, with the opening of the self and the entrance of two people into each other's selves. And Hildebrand doesn't. He doesn't begin with a narrow sense of community. And so I thought, gosh, well, what is community then? And step by step, he unfolds it. So as I said, there's a spoiler going down the outline, so don't look there. But I'm joking, of course, you can look there. So I'm really going to depend on what's already been given us by Dr. Spencer's presentation and Dr. Crosby's presentation. They've been such a good background to what I'm doing today, and especially things like value, the concept of value Dr. Spencer spoke about, and so did Dr. Crosby, the nature of a social act. Unfortunately, I can't go through all of these things. So, but maybe just to define the virtus unitiva, that means the unitive power of value. And so that's the phrase that Hildebrand uses. He actually leaves it in German in the translation. Excuse me, the translator leaves it in Latin, and he himself uses it in Latin because it has such a classical sound to it. But that's what it means. Okay, so and then I'd like to also briefly define the word metaphysical, because it can be a little bit intimidating. But really here, I'm going to define it kind of in a popular way. It just means getting to the deepest root of something. So for our purposes, that will be enough. So what he's doing here really is very metaphysical. And it sounds rather abstract, and it is rather abstract, but I'm going to show how what Hildebrand does beautifully applies to real life. It has beautiful practical implications, and I'm going to try to draw some of those out. Okay, so we have heard two ways that value is unitive in Dr. Crosby's talk. The first way is that values attract us, so we're already drawn to the other through their intrinsic value. And then values, drawing a blank on the second way. And then values also open us up in our depth and make us recognize that there's a union amongst all of us because of that opening that values effect within the soul. And we're today going to see a third way that values are unitive. It's going to be the key to what I'm doing. So what I'd like to do is, and then the last point is the question of the definition of community in the narrow sense. Can we come up strictly speaking, with a definition. I actually think it's not really possible. We can perceive the reality of community, but to find words that frame exactly what community is, I'm not sure that we can do. But what I'll do is I go along, I'm going to draw out the elements of Hildebrand's analysis that come very close to giving us a definition of community. We're going to find the principles that give rise to community, but a dictionary definition is going to be difficult. Still, I'm going to try to point out those elements as we come across them. So I'd like to begin with two quotations that underline the importance of value in the formation of community. Hildebrand says, excuse me, okay. The virtus unitiva of the world of values is effective not only in the subjective experience of being united among those who are consciously seized by a value, but also value purely objectively unites those in close proximity to the value's sphere of influence, and under certain circumstances unites them in a new whole. Another quote, among the principles of unity that are capable of constituting a community structure, the virtus unitiva of values is the most important and most genuine. Okay, so now I'm going to begin with what you have on your outlines. Part 1, the metaphysical structure of community. So I want to begin with just very briefly considering what community in the narrow sense is not. So first of all, it's not a relationship. So a relationship is based on a mutual interpersonal connection between two persons. And it does endure beyond individual moments of relation. So we have a relationship in some sense forms a new unity and persists beyond individual acts. But Hildebrand says that's not community in the narrow sense. He says that even in cases where it seems as though we already have a community, we don't, namely in the case of a union of love. So this is the part of the thriller part of this presentation. Well, then what is it? There is a new unity when two persons love each other deeply, but it's not enough to constitute a community. So we're going to leave that hanging for now. So he says a community is not an aggregate of persons, and Dr. Crosby, I think, illuminated that very well. So persons that belong to a set, for example, all persons over 6 feet tall. Thirdly, community exists independently of any observer. It's not something that we impose on reality through our imagination. So for example, he says, we say a month is 30 days, and we've created a kind of unity there. But can you see that's wholly arbitrary and created by the mind? He says community is not this kind of union. Finally, he says community is not a higher or more intense degree of relationship. Isn't that interesting? Not a higher and more intense degree of relationship. He says rather it's structurally entirely different from a being united of persons through an interpenetration of looks. Certain communities will include that, but that's not going to be enough to form community. Okay, secondly, now I want to turn to a first important feature of community. He says community is a new individual, a new whole. And Dr. Spencer and Dr. Crosby have also spoken about this. So this is a very important element. I think we could call it element number 1 in the definition of community. So he says it really is a unitary thing, a quasi-substance, substance-like, although he does strongly deny that it is a substance. So a quote that you have on your sheets, the persons involved in community form an objective, real whole whose members they are. Their connectedness as members of a whole is distinct from their connectedness in an experiential relationship. Very interesting. So a community has some new center of oneness that goes beyond the oneness constituted by the connection amongst the persons themselves based on an interpersonal relation. Okay, so we're going to illuminate this point later. So number 3, how individual persons are related to the community to which they belong. Okay? How are persons related to the community, to this new whole that transcends them in some way? How are they related to it? And here I think, again, Dr. Crosby already has illuminated this for us. So each person remains an individual whole within the community. He's not dissolved into the community, and he's not subordinated to the community. So he's not like an organ that contributes to the functioning of a body, for example. Each person retains his own substantiality. In some sense, we can say that the community is actually subservient to the person. Okay. So now we want to enter into something new that we haven't heard about yet. It's called what Hildebrand calls the principle of unity of a community. So what we're asking here is, how is it that a community is formed? What element serves as the principle of unity of persons in this new whole, this new kind of individual entity? So if it's not the interpersonal relationship that makes this unity, what does? So kind of being detectives here. So he says that there are different ways, that different principles of unity. So the first type of community is the one that's founded on love, or love-like responses between two persons. He says this kind of community arises on the basis of the interpenetrating look of love of a very high degree between two persons and under a certain condition. Okay, so what we're talking about here, we're taking the case where two persons are relating to one another, they've opened themselves to one another in their depth, and they have mutually, in a sense, given and received one another. He says, here we're prepared to find one type of community, but the interpenetration of looks doesn't yet form the communities for what does. He says there's a certain condition that has to come into play in order for a community to be established. He says a community can arise when there is a material participation in the being of the other person. A material participation in the being of the other person. And then he further illuminates this. He says a community is formed in two persons who are related in love when, quote, there is a formal identification of the other's subjectivity with one's own. Okay, a formal identification of the other's subjectivity with one's own on the part of both parties. Okay, so here to explain this a little bit, subjectivity is kind of a technical term in Hildebrand's work. He first talks about this in depth in The Nature of Love, and Dr. Crosby translated the German word that Hildebrand uses, Eigenleben, as subjectivity. And in German, Eigenleben means one's own life. So it's everything that has to do with what concerns one's own happiness, one's own destiny. In this formal identification, what happens is that all the concerns of the other, the destiny of the other, becomes as if one's own. It's as if you could say there's a center within the person that becomes almost displaced by the other. Everything that is important to the other now grips one as if it were oneself. And each person does this for the other. And he says it's only when this happens in a formal way that each person now lives in the other and they become together a we, that you have now this new whole, this community. Now there's a quote that you have on your sheet there. Before I read the quote, he says, the interpenetration of looks doesn't establish his community, but this act of formal identification flows in some sense from the interpenetration of looks. He writes, the person who has been fully opened in love, whose interior spiritually breaks through his exterior to reach the interior of the beloved person, who in turn requites his love and grants him unhindered access, becomes united with the beloved in a corpus through the formal identification at the level of subjectivity. The end of quote. So he says at this point, a separate, intimate space is formed, and it's definitively fenced off from others and from the external world. Each person exists no longer as an I with respect to the rest of the world, but as a we. So the two together now face the world. It really is, there are two poles now, we, us, and the rest of the world. So I don't think this one is on your handout, but there's a beautiful quote. He says, "The stream of life, with all its occurrences, no longer addresses itself to an isolated subjectivity, but rather to both persons jointly. The issue of the other becomes entirely one's own issue." End of quote. So he says the typical case of this is found in spousal love, but it can also occur between two friends, and he gives as one example the friendship between David and Jonathan. So here you have a very deep love in which actually the step was taken of a kind of formal identification. Okay. But according to Hildebrand, most communities are not founded in this way, are not formed in this way. Most communities, he says, quote, "do not presuppose any such mutual connectedness between individual members. They do not even require that the members have any explicitly mutual acquaintance with one another," end of quote, "nor that there is anything like love between them, and there is certainly no formal identification at the level of subjectivity." So an example of this would be the community membership in a nation, or in a state, or even in an association. So then we have to go on and ask the next question as detectives, what then is the principle of unity in this case? There must be some other factor or factors that can unite these persons into a new whole. So now Hildebrand goes on to distinguish between two other kinds of communities. So we had the community that's formed in this interpenetration of looks and through it. And now we have a second type of community. He says the communities that are constituted from without and not by the virtus unitiva of value. So even for Hildebrand, there are some communities that are not formed under the unifying power of value. So first, and under this, there are two forms. So he says there are communities that are constituted wholly by a social act. And here I can't spend time on this. Dr. Spencer spoke about this. It's where there's a willed mutual agreement, something formal. You sign a paper, as it were, whereby you pledge to enter into this unity. So he says, by a social act, the people who enter into the act do not form a mere collection of persons, but are formed into a new unit, a new whole, in some way transcending the collection of the individuals. But Hildebrand calls this a meager and bloodless type of community. It's very thin, because the principle of unity is an external principle. And he contrasts with a full-blooded community of love, where you have this material constitution at its core. But he also contrasts it with other, what he calls classical communities, like the nation and the state, which we're going to look at in a moment. Before we do that, we want to look at the second type of community, which is constituted from without, which is the community of the life circle. He says this is a very primitive type of community, although he'll say it's actually going to play a role in constituting other kinds of communities. He says, when persons are brought together by external life circumstances, especially geographically, they do in some sense come to belong together. And he says it's in this section where he gives us a hint as to another defining element of community. He says they do concern each other in some way. That's going to be very important. So he says it's a real community, but a very primitive one. So just a quote, he says, the community arises not through particular interpersonal stances, but through the external factor of living together, end of quote. So thirdly, now we turn to what he calls classical communities, and these are the ones that are going to be more robust, more full-blooded, thicker kind of community. The family, the state, the nation, and the circle of friends are the ones that he names. And these, he says now, are formed under the action of the uniting power of values. So these communities don't arise merely on the basis of a social act, nor merely on the basis of a factual living together. What other factor then has the power to unite persons into these kinds of communities? So to answer this question, Hildebrand says, we have to now remind ourselves again of the virtus unitiva of values. There are going to be two things to consider here, and you have this in your outline. The first is the kind of values that have a community-forming power, because not all values can unite into the particular kind of whole that is a community. Even though all values are unitive in some way, not all have the power to unite into a community. So that's the first question. What kind of values can do this? And the second question is, what kind of relationship of the individuals is required in order for a community to arise? In other words, what kind of relationship of individuals to the value itself is required for a community to arise? So let's first turn to the first question. What kind of value is unitive? So you have this quote on your handout there. Only those value domains come into consideration that address themselves to the person in a very specific, primary way. Values which manifest certain reference to the true vocation of the human person, or as we might also say, which manifest as such a certain classical indispensability for the human person, such as the sphere of law, the value domain of love in its different categories, and the value domain of culture, and so forth. End of quote. So in saying what these values do, we catch sight of a second element in the definition of community. Such values, writes Hildebrand, quote, so this is on your handout, it's very important, create an interpersonal situation, okay, they create an interpersonal situation, and in another place he says, establish a potent interpersonal situation, in which the persons as such come to concern each other in a particular way and become objectively ordered toward one another. So it's very important. Now, of course, this is true also in community in the broader sense, right? Friends who are not a community in the narrow sense also concern each other in some way. That's why I'm saying it's difficult to define and capture exactly what community in the narrow sense is. But in any case, we have something very important here. Persons come to concern each other in a specific way and become objectively ordered to one another. This is very striking if you think of something like the community of humanity. All of us concern each other in one way and order to one another in one way. Okay, so I want to highlight something important here. So we've seen that Hildebrand denies that the interpersonal situation is what grounds a community, right? So he's denied that the interpersonal grounds the community. So the togetherness of persons within a community is not what makes for community. And in this way, Hildebrand is different from others who write about community, because somebody like either Stein or Shaler, they immediately highlight, right, the relationship amongst persons. And he says, no, that's not what constitutes the community. And yet, what's implied here is that the kind of union property to community is inseparably linked to relationship, and is going to have practical implications. So the involvement of persons with one another is going to be different depending on what Hildebrand calls the meaning sphere proper to the personal community. Sometimes it involves the depth of the person, and sometimes it doesn't. But some relationship between persons is necessarily implied by community. Some responsibility, some being ordered to, is always going to arise when people find themselves within community. So I think this is a very important point, and it's going to be filled out in section 3 when we look at the meaning spheres of community. Okay. Good. So there we've talked about what kind of value can unite persons into community and some of the implications of that, and the new element in the definition of Hildebrand's idea of community. And now we turn to the second question. What kind of incorporation into these values is necessary for a community to come into existence? So, and here again, there are two, now you see why I gave you an outline. This is rather complex, isn't it? And I've pre-digested this for you. It's even more complex when you're reading the text itself. So he says, the first kind of incorporation is the one that gives rise to the community of humanity. I've already mentioned that one. So Hildebrand writes very beautifully about this. I wish I had time to unpack it. He says, it is, quote, the incorporation that arises on the basis of the objective ordination of the human person to the world of values as a whole, and especially in relation to the epitome of all values, God, which is rooted purely in the human person's objective nature. So I'll translate that for you. So he says, in this case, you have, of course, certain kind of values, the values that are very potent. What are they? The whole world of values, and especially God. And how are we incorporated into them? He says, simply by virtue of being a creature. As soon as we're created by God, we are incorporated into the whole world of values and into a relation with God of some very important source. Right there, we have a community under the unitive power of these values. Now we have another case of incorporation. He says there's also the case of communities that are formed by the unitive power of individual value domains. So in the first case, you have all values as a whole. All persons are ordered to somehow be incorporated and live in relation to the world of values. But now he says certain communities, particular communities, are formed by the unitive power of individual value domains. And he says, we have to next ask the question, under what conditions then are persons incorporated into these value domains? And here we have a two-pronged answer. This is on your outline. So first he says, it's not enough that persons be objectively ordered to some value domain. Okay. It's not enough if someone is explicitly, subjectively turned and responsive to some value domain. So you have two persons who are relating to the same value domain. He says that's not enough for them to be incorporated into a community. He says beyond both of these, a particular situation must exist that makes the value domain have, quote, interpersonal topicality. Okay? So persons have to find themselves by virtue of some factor, which we're going to explore in a moment, that a virtue somehow is made relevant to them and draws them into its own orbit. And only then is that particular value going to be unitive and form those persons into a community. So what does it mean to say that a value becomes topical for them? I already talked about this. He says it means that particular persons, I'm quoting here, particular persons have become oriented toward a particular value domain or become incorporated in it, end of quote. So there we have the first prong. Some value has to become topical. Now, the second prong is, what is the factor that makes this incorporation happen? The factor is going to be different depending on the community. There are different kinds of community, and there are going to be different kinds of factors that operate to constitute these communities, to constitute the topicality of some value domain. So he says in the case of the family, it's the factor of the common origin of the members of the family in the love of the spouses. Okay? The common origin of the members of the family in the love of the spouses. So what happens when you have this common origin? He says there's a certain kind of love that they're going to be related to, the value of love, that is then going to be unitive of them. Okay? Then he says, takes a second kind of community. In the case of the state, he says the factor of sharing a life circle based on geographical situation. Okay? So when persons find themselves together in a life circle, in a geographically delimited space, what value is then going to become topical for them? The value of law, he says. Now all these persons are related to the domain of law, and a community is constituted. In the case of marriage, another kind of community, he says it's going to be a solemn social act that makes a certain domain of values unitive then for the spouses and creating a new whole. Okay, so part 5 now, or the conclusion to part 1. I want to here just recap on the importance of value and the reality that is community. So I said that it's almost impossible to define community. One can only point to it and try to get as close as possible to describing its essence. We've already named two elements in Hildebrand's definition. It's a new whole, and it's a situation in which persons come to concern one another in a particular way. But towards the end of this chapter on the unifying principles of community, I believe that Hildebrand takes another step in illuminating the essence of the new kind of whole that we have. And it's when he describes the metaphysical aspect of the unitive power of value. You have this quote on your handout. A value domain as a sovereign principle grasps and encompasses persons specifically from above. This, I think, is a beautiful contribution of Hildebrand's. Irrespective of the connection between its power and the power that is present in the inner space between the persons, it unites them from above and from without in a gesture reserved for its sovereignty, as it were. Primarily through the power previously discussed, the domain of value is especially constitutive of the structural moment that plays an integrating role in its nature as community. So there's some infrastructure of community. Where does it come from? And he says it's this sovereign act, gesture of values. Here's another very beautiful dimension of Hildebrand's value theory. It grasps persons. So a second quote here, I think you have this also on your handout. In what was just discussed and in all that precedes it, says Hildebrand, one factor has emerged with ever greater clarity, namely the dominant role played by the virtus unitiva of values in the sphere of the constitution of communities. It has become increasingly clear that the more a community is truly a community, the more it represents a genuine whole in which human persons are truly united, the more important is the constitutive function of values within it. Only those community entities constituted out of the sphere of values are communities in the full sense. End of quote. Okay. So now we have a kind of third element in the definition. Let's quickly recap on what we have. So the community is a new whole in which persons come to concern each other and belong to one another in a certain way, and which is taken up, in a sense, into a new space existing above the individual persons and above the interpersonal relationships under the action of value. Okay. So part two, the meaning spheres of, communities' meaning spheres. So at the end of his discussion on the unifying principles of community, Hildebrand introduces the concept of the meaning sphere. The idea of meaning sphere is a bit complex, but it's really essential to Hildebrand's idea of community. So we'll only follow his discussion of the meaning sphere of genuine communities, so classical communities of the family, the nation, and the state. He says these are the ones that have a genuine spiritual unity, an inner fullness, a material cohesion. Okay, so these phrases are important with reference to the meaning sphere of community. He says the inner fullness coming about through the community constituting power of value is where one finds the meaning sphere of community. So this is going to become more clear as I go along, but I'll read that again. The inner fullness coming about through the community constituting power of value is where one finds the meaning sphere of community. Okay, so what he's telling us is that every community is not just a kind of, you could say, technical hanging together of persons. There's actually some kind of ethos or matter or substance in which the persons are, in a sense, cemented, or by which they're cemented. It has a qualitative content to it. You see that? It's not just like a hinging together, but there's some matter. And he says this is where we find the meaning sphere of community. He says it fills the community from within and forms it. It's like a formal cause in classical terminology or scholastic terminology. He says the meaning sphere is produced by the values that unify the community. Okay? The meaning sphere is produced by the values. He says it also serves those values. A very interesting point that I'll expand on when I give a particular example. Right? So now Hildebrand isn't talking about the principle of community itself, but as it were about the ethos of that in which everyone is held together. So I'd like to read a quote to you relative to this. It's on your handout. The meaning sphere represents, in a certain sense, a plastically formed, interpersonally realized holistic gesture that encompasses people in itself and orders them towards value which hover above the community. Aren't you glad I predigested this for you a little? He says, values that have produced the meaning sphere and which it serves. It is, as it were, the inner life of the community. It forms the air that fills its interpersonal inner space, and at the same time, it conditions the shape of its exterior. Okay. I have another quote there, I think, relative to this. I think it's useful to read. The meaning sphere may not be confused with purpose in the proper sense of the term, since we are rather dealing with the immanent theme, with the entire sphere of the meaningful as it is alive in the community. I'd like to pause over that for a second. So communities also can have a purpose, which in some sense unites them. When people strive for some goal together, you can say it in some sense defines them and gives some content to their togetherness. There's a kind of a teleological dimension of community. Hildebrand's saying this is not what we're talking about here. Right? We're talking about something that is more immanent and more constitutive and precedes any kind of teleological dimension or teleological action on the part of the persons. So he says, it is something in which every member lives and moves insofar as he lives in the community. In the case of many genuine communities, such as humanity or dual personal communities based on love, he says with the exception of marriage, it is entirely absurd to speak of a purpose, and yet precisely these communities are characterized by highly developed and significant meaning spheres. Okay. So now we look at the second dimension of the meaning sphere. Hildebrand says meaning sphere also indicates the task of the members. Here we're moving a little bit now into the practical implications of this theory. So it indicates the tasks of the members, and in some cases the tasks of the community as a whole. So considering this dimension of Hildebrand's work made me realize again the depth and genius of his analysis of community. When I first began reflecting on the work in preparation for the presentation, I was struck by how very metaphysical his work was. It seemed to me not to have the richness of someone like Edith Stein's theory of community, at the heart of which is the person in his or her interiority. Because community is experientially based, not entirely for her, but it's a very important element for her, her theory immediately gives rise to these practical issues. And Hildebrand's view, by contrast, does not seem to have this same relation to practical aspect of life. But with Hildebrand's illumination of the dimension of community that he calls its meaning sphere, the practical dimension of community comes flooding in. The aspect of meaning sphere, as we have seen, is constituted independently of experience, and yet it has decisive implications both for experience and for action. But further, his metaphysical idea of meaning sphere seems to tremendously enrich the sphere of experience and of action. So earlier we saw that in a community, persons come to concern one another in a specific way, and they're ordered to one another. And I said that I would flesh this out. And this is what meaning sphere does for us. It defines how persons now come to concern one another, and in what way they are objectively ordered to one another, and then what tasks this ordering implies. So look at what the meaning sphere does for the members of the community in which it animates. So I have 4 points here. The meaning sphere gives shape and general content to the relationships. Okay? Can someone entering into marriage then just do whatever he wants, act in whatever way he wants? The community defines the parameters. You could say gives the gift of a rich content to the relationship. So it gives shape and general content to the relationships within the community. It thus governs the meaning of the actions of the members towards one another. It also indicates the kinds of actions they ought to undertake towards one another. And it indicates the spirit that ought to animate the actions or the tasks, the kind of love-like attitudes that should be present. So it's not left up to the individuals to create the meaning of the relationship. How persons are to relate to one another within communities is not arbitrary or left up to the individual decisions of the persons. Our experience is always already conditioned and shaped by the meaning sphere of the community in which we dwell. And our free actions, our free decisions about these actions, are given a rich playing field by the meaning sphere. Community is constituted by a power beyond us, the power of value, so rich in content, and this value communicates to the relationship some of its own wealth of content. I think it's marvelous that we find ourselves ensconced and encompassed in value. It's communicated to the fabric of the relationship. So I'd like to end with looking at one example of a meaning sphere. And I'm taking the case of the family. What is the meaning sphere in which the family, the community of the family, dwells? So family belongs to the kind of community that Hildebrand calls a community of love or a community of unity. That's marriage, the family, and the circle of friends are these kinds of community. In these communities, the love among its members is the theme. That is the community itself. The value of being united in love itself is centrally thematic for this community. So then he denotes 4 meaning spheres that are proper to the family, 1 primary one, and 3 that follow closely upon it. So let's go through those. He says that being united in love is the primary meaning sphere. And what I'd like to do now is take the quote that we looked at above and plug in, so to speak, the particular meaning sphere of the family into all of its elements. So being united in love is the inner life of the family. To be united in love forms the air that fills its interpersonal space, this is Hildebrand's language. Being joined together in loving union is the value that hovers above the family, that encompasses the members of the family, and to which the family community is ordered. And it is also the value which the family's communal life serves. So the love that is realized within the family is realized according to 3 categories of love. So this idea of the categories of love is also technical. He deals with it in depth in the book, The Nature of Love. So they have a kind of different structure. So there's parental love, filial love, and sibling love. And each of these has a slightly different theme. So he says in parental love, there is the responsible care for the child and the child's education and development. That's the meaning sphere that the parents find themselves encompassed by. In the case of filial love, the child's love for the parents, he says the reverential and receptive attitude towards the parents as the representatives of the objectively valid world, being nourished by the atmosphere that surrounds them. It's very beautiful. I think it's very sobering for the parents. Right? What is it that what's the meaning that the child is surrounded by? Well, a reverential and receptive attitude towards the parents. Why? Because they represent the objective world. And they are nourished by the atmosphere that surrounds them. Okay. And in sibling love, it's delightful what he says here. He says it's a being together in life. Anybody who has a sibling that they're close with, I think, can understand this. It's a very lovely expression. This is the theme of the love between siblings. Secondly, the second dimension of the meaning sphere of the family, He says it includes what he calls the originary interior milieu. So what is it that the family gives? He says it's a milieu. The family provides a milieu that is charged with a specific atmosphere and which forms for each person his home, the nest that surrounds him, and in which he normally grows and flourishes. Again, if I was doing a course on marriage and family, I would give these sections to my students to read. I think for parents to understand that what they're doing is creating the air that the child is imbibing as the soul is formed. This is one of the themes of the meaning sphere of the family. So he says this milieu is supposed to be love-filled. And he says it includes various things. He says it's the cultural world in which the family lives, the economic material sphere in which the family is dwelling. It's the house, the food, the clothing, and so forth. Just as a little example, I'm so grateful to my parents that even though we were economically very strapped, they never worried about money. They created an important milieu for their children not to be anxious about money, and it was deeply formative of us, and I'm very grateful for that. Thirdly, the third dimension of the meaning sphere, he says, the ordering of persons to one another in love, which we find in the first meaning, gives rise to another meaning sphere, and he says, an originary community of life. Okay, so community of life is not a community of love. It's not the same thing, he says. It's a little bit more pragmatic, and he resists the idea that this is why families form, so that somehow they can practically manage, right? The husband has a job that the wife doesn't have, and she supplements what he can't do, and so forth. He denies that that's the basis of the family. But he says there are certain aspects of this that actually occur, that follow upon the union of persons in love. He calls it the originary community of life. So he doesn't explain it in depth, but he says there's a kind of living together that constitutes the deep fabric of everyday life of its members. And the final meaning sphere of the family community, I don't know if I have this, it's a final quote, I don't know if it's in your, okay, I do, good. It's a rather long one. So he says, the value of the person as such, as well as its being understood and responded to, plays a dominant role. This is what I spoke about in my panels over the last 2 days. The value of the person as such, as well as its being understood and responded to, plays a dominant role. The development and unfolding of the personality in all its individual value potentialities plays a dominant role, not only because this moment is fully thematic in the family in general, but also because of the unique task that it involves for the parents in relation to their children. Here, the family extends into the metaphysical sphere in a special way, insofar as, in this respect, the parents act as God's representatives. And he says it's this meaning sphere that gives rise to the authoritative structure of the family. And finally, as a final point, then Hildebrand told us that the meaning sphere gives, you could say, this ethos, this content, but it also indicates the tasks. In a sense, we already have reviewed the tasks by understanding the particular meaning sphere, because the meaning sphere then indicates how the members of the community ought to comport towards one another. He says the meaning sphere contains an instruction or a mandate to the individual members of the community. In some sense now they are responsible to live up to the meaning sphere, and in this sense serve the values of the meaning sphere. So they are not, even though there's a lot of liberty, they're not at liberty, the members of the community, to define the meaning of their unity. So, there you have it, the nuts and bolts of Hildebrand's view of community. I hope that I've convinced you that in spite of its very metaphysical and abstract elements, it also, I think, is very, very rich and very meaningful for the practical dimensions of life. So now I'll take your questions. Thank you.
Charles.
Maria, that was very illuminating. Thank you so much. There's a community that I think of that is never mentioned in what you presented, the church. Can you comment on that? You heard family, nation, circle of friends.
Yes. For Hildebrand, in fact, the church is the highest kind of community, and it has it's material and formal. It's one that transcends the individual members most fully, and yet most fully and deeply unites them. And all I can say is, if you read the section in his book, you'll find that he has so much to say about the community of the church, and he considers it, in some sense, central. He even goes so far as to say there's one sense in which the community of the church is an exception to the idea that the whole is subordinated to the individuals. There's some sense in which he says the individual, of course, doesn't disappear. In fact, this confirms and affirms the individual even more. But the membership in Christ is a very particular kind of union. So, and I wish I had time, I could have given a presentation on that, but it's a very good question and a very important one. Yeah, thank you. And of course, it has its own meaning sphere, and right, all of those implications as well. It binds the members in a certain way, gives them certain tasks and responsibilities. Yeah, Bill.
Maria, thank you. I have a question in regard to the kind of the differences that you're seeing between von Hildebrand's view of community and the views of Shaler and Edith Stein, because you framed some of the discussion in terms of this apparent difference, but I don't know that I see as much of a difference, and particularly the fact that for both Shaler and for Stein, and I'm going to maybe focus more on Stein because I work on Stein, but for both, value does have that unifying role in community, and this is because for Stein, person is value valent, and how we live out of our core, or whether we live out of our core, is related to our openness to the full breadth of value and responding to it in its depth. So that when you have the quote on the end of page 2 there, ending, through the power previously discussed, the domain of value is especially constitutive of the structural moment that plays an integrating role in its nature as community. I could see Stein and Shaler both agreeing wholeheartedly to that idea. But it strikes me that one thing that does certainly constitute a difference between Stein, Shaler, and von Hildebrand on this question is maybe primarily in how each understands value. Because von Hildebrand, in comparison to the two, understands value in a much more restrictive way. Where it's distinguished from the merely subjectively satisfying and distinguished from the objective good for the person. Whereas Shaler, and I think Stein follows Shaler on this, will see those as simply different domains of value, and thus interpersonal relations that are unified by values of these sorts are still communities, although maybe of a more superficial nature because of the superficiality of the values involved. So that von Hildebrand, maybe in construing community in a narrower sense, is doing so, at least so far as I can tell, maybe because he understands value in a much narrower sense. So I'm wondering, what are the implications of that kind of narrowing of community because we're narrowing the notion of value?
Yeah.
And how does that bring out maybe different implications.
Yes, yeah, thank you. So first, I want to preface this by saying I'm not an expert in the theory of community of Stein, and less even of Shaler. However, I will say this, that first of all, I fully agree with everything that you said. For Stein, value is central, but there are, in a sense, three ways in which value is unitive. So Dr. Crosby mentioned two, where it's the value of the other person that attracts. And there has a unifying power already just by that attraction. And then you have the fact that it opens us in our depth as well. And Stein writes about that very beautifully also when she talks about how the environment can influence the character of a community, just the beauty of it or the ugliness or whatever it is. But there's a third way that value is unifying, which, as far as I can tell, but here I may not know Stein well enough to know, this unifying power from above, which is in some sense wholly independent of the knowing being influenced of persons. So if somebody finds themselves together geographically, whether they know it or not, or whether they have entered into it or agreed to it, they are already objectively united. And that is something that I think it takes a little bit of thought. How is it that, what is this? What does this mean, this subjective unification? And so I just would like to maybe highlight that, and whether it's somewhere in Stein, it's something that I would be happy to learn about. And I loved your second point. And all I'll say about that is the following, because it's present actually. First I'll say there are two dimensions to what you said. First of all, you said that for Stein and Shaler, you have gradations of value and not. So, and I'm just going to actually leave that aside for now because I can't see immediately what implications that has for the theory of community. But another dimension of it I will respond to, which Hildebrand does say that people can be united by the pleasant, or by what you could say more superficial, but he never uses that word. He just says that there's a hierarchy of values, and people can be united by certain more lighthearted activities, and even simply by some pleasant activity. And so there's a little bit of complexity in the way he does that, but he still says, it's very complex. He still says that there's a value beyond that, which you call something like a vital value. And that's I love your question, because he actually even relates things like the pleasant. In a sense, they're also subsumed under value. And he even says that having pleasures is an objective good for the person. But it's still, for him, he still keeps a kind of a distinction between them, but they can be nested in one another. And ultimately, he will say that even the community based on something like some kinds of pleasures, pleasant activities, is still unified by this sense of value that maybe is unique to him. So I hope that I addressed your comments. They're very helpful.
Thank you, Dr. Fedoryka, for this wonderful expose, and I'm amazed by the clarity and
that's Hildebrand.
Also of Hildebrand. Yeah. So the amazing richness of how he describes community, the probably also German precision with which he does that. So my question then, in front of all this richness, comes up, okay, how all this becomes life? How can this help me in life? Now, I tried to answer that myself, and maybe you could comment on things that, how Hildebrand would answer these things. So we're thinking, for a community, I was thinking there must be first an awareness of a deep need. I'm alone. I'm needy. And this neediness becomes easily an experience of solitude. So I need a community. The second thing is, for living a community, I was thinking there must be somehow an ongoing education that never stops. What would Hildebrand say about that? Mm-hmm. And again, also authoritative persons, so persons that live the community in a more profound, mature, deeper way. There's a line in the Didache that says, look every day for the faces of the saints. That means the members of the community, through which I can imbue the sense and depth of community. And then I was also thinking about the need of prayer in the sense of asking. The asking, I think also Hildebrand said, in the end, community is a gift and the origin of the community is Christ himself. So there's then also needed a kind of a continuity of prayer. Does Hildebrand say something about these aspects?
What was your second point again, just briefly? You said the first is I am needy.
Was an ongoing education.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So maybe to your last 3 points, I'll just say they're very beautiful, and I know that Hildebrand would agree with them. They're not present in his analysis because that's not the level at which he's doing the analysis. I just want to respond to the first one, this recognition of our neediness. Hildebrand would certainly affirm that within community is where our needs are met. He would certainly affirm that. But he would not say that that is the foundation of community. That's more a fruit of community. The foundation of community would be, now I said yesterday that there are 4 different meanings of need, and I only gave you 2, but here you have need that is not based on an emptiness, but it's simply based on the nature of the human person. He would say the human person is ordained to live with and for others, and that in some sense the essence of the person comes to fullness of being only in and through community. But that's different than being based on an emptiness or a neediness. Now, of course, you might mean that in using the term need, but Hildebrand avoids that because of the connotations of basically it's kind of has a danger of bringing us back to an individualism. I associate because I'm needy. I think that Hildebrand would say, once I've entered into community, I can recognize with gratitude that my needs have been filled, but that happens as a gift, and the primary motive is really a living out of our personhood as being made to be gifts for one another. And here we're drawn into community, I think, by our lively personhood, our being awakened as persons. We recognize that we're made for love, and we're drawn to others, and so forth. So I hope that was clear. I think that's a rather important point for Hildebrand.
Yeah. Yes, I was wondering if it requires a positive value response in order for a community to be formed. Does a person have to say yes to a value in order to be incorporated in the community?
Yeah.
For example, in the case of humanity, we can say that all persons are objectively ordered towards God, but not everyone. Many people reject God. So can we then say that humanity is a community?
Yes. So in Hildebrand, it's very clear. The answer is yes. Persons are in community, and he explicitly says this, even if they aren't responding subjectively to value. So I won't argue for that. I'll just tell you that Hildebrand is absolutely clear about it, that one finds oneself in the community of humanity just by the objective relationship to God. And I think it would be wonderful to have a deeper discussion about that. I'm not really prepared to do so. But there's something very mysterious here, and I think that we shouldn't take for granted. There's a kind of a memorandum. Why is it that we are knitted together by the fact that we are all destined for God and to God? So I think the question is a very important one, and I think it would lead us into new depths. It might have something to do with the essentially relational nature of the person, and you find within the Trinity that to be person is to be in relation. And is it possible that something like that is instituted among human persons, so that you can imagine what heaven's going to be like when that's actually activated, that communion of persons? And we actually find that within the church, the communion of saints. There's a real relationship. So I said I wouldn't say too much in response to your question, but I think it's a very important one. And unfortunately, I'm not really prepared to illuminate what's behind that for Hildebrand. I'll just tell you that, yeah. There are certain communities that for him depend on the subjective incorporation into values. In other words, that people are really responding to certain values. And that's in the other part of the book where he talks about communities in the wider sense. And it's really lovely. He says that when two persons find themselves loving the same kinds of values, they're in a position then to be united into a community through their relationship to those values. So there are some communities that are formed by the subjective participation of the persons in the community. But in some, it's not the case. Yeah.
Peter?
Peter.
This is not my question. I want to say an observation. I would love to hear how markets fit into the typology of communities as well. So that's just an observation.
So the question is how markets fit into that.
Two questions, though, and I think they're related. I think they're related to Bill's also, so I'll ask them and you can decide what you want to respond to. The idea of the virtus unitiva in von Hildebrandt's account reminds me somewhat of St. Augustine in the City of God, where in Book 19 he describes political communities as held together by, in his phrase, shared loves. And he says, the better the loves, the better the people, the worse the loves, the worse the people, which sort of suggests that there might be disvalues as well as values uniting certain communities together. For example, he says that the ancient Romans, whom he prefers to the Romans of his own time, that they were held together predominantly by the love of glory, for the sake of which they suppressed many other vices, and he calls it splendid vice. So one question, I'm curious as to what extent you think that is similar to or also different from what von Hildebrandt is doing here. And then the other question, and this may just be an unfair question because I'm relying on your attempt to walk us through what's obviously very complex, and even just listening, I have the sense that von Hildebrandt anticipates many objections in ways that aren't going to come through in a quick summary. But if I tried to characterize the feel or the flavor of the account of community that I'm getting, it emphasizes the unified nature of a community, held together by this virtus unitiva. It emphasizes this sort of, for want of a better phrase, top-down nature of that unification. The value comes from above and without. You quoted him as saying at one point. And it also sounds as though the community once formed has a kind of character. So it feels somewhat static to me. So unitary, formed from without and above, and static. And so I might contrast that with what at least feels to me like a somewhat different way of talking, but might not be. I don't know. I could imagine giving an account of community in somewhat different terms, as growing from the ground up, as the consequence of perhaps material interactions that we have with each other over a period of time in which values maybe supervene on those relationships over time, but are perhaps not there from the start, forming the community, which might evolve in various ways. And so just thinking of a kind of a contrast, unified versus perhaps more diverse, top-down versus ground-up, static versus evolving. That's probably somewhat polemically framed, but just to get us, if you could respond to whether that is really a different way of thinking about community, or whether von Hildebrandt has some way of thinking about those questions as well.
So your first point was a question how Hildebrandt's idea of community relates maybe to what Augustine is saying. Okay, yeah. So I of course I'm answering on the fly right now, and I know that passage in Augustine. I would suspect that what Augustine is talking about there would line up more with a culture in Hildebrandt's, because he does say that culture is also forms a community, and that's my sense. And I think that without looking at it in detail, the technical aspect, there's a great parallel there. I think that he would agree with Augustine that because he says that cultures also have a certain character, and he gives the objective structure of how cultures are unified, but they also have a content, as Augustine says, that are going to be determined by which values play that role. Okay, so you see that? So there's an infrastructure that makes this community be a cultural community, and then there's the content of it. And I think, as far as I can tell, there would be a great parallel between the two. Augustine called it a political community, though, and Hildebrand wouldn't, just because of maybe that's something I can't answer. As for the second, let me see. So I want to say, do I have the text enough at my fingertips to be able to answer that fully? But I want to say that Hildebrand would acknowledge this dimension that you're talking about. And it's in the first part of the book, which I didn't cover here, where he talks about I partially answered that in response to Bill's question. He does say that particular values unite persons into relationships. And those particular values will definitely characterize or influence the milieu of the relationship. But what he does, and this is where I would almost have to look at the text again because I don't have it, but he'll say that you have the particular values. I'll go by way of the example that he gives. He says, you find two persons who are extremely different in personality and temperament, and somehow they form a friendship. And you say, what's the unifying value here? Because they're so very different. And he'll say, still you will find something in each of them where, and in their depth, they're responsive to something that's the same, that might transcend their temperament and their personalities, such as, for example, a vital value that each will see in the other something that she or she is also captivated by. And that is going to determine the nature of that community. So where I'm a little bit, I don't know if Dr. Crosby can fill this out more, but where I'm a little bit drawing a blank is how does this, you have community in the broad sense and in the narrow sense. And I'm wondering whether what I'm saying only applies to community in the broad sense, but not to the community of the family in the same way. Of course, Hildebrand would say you can have a family, Dr. Crosby read this quote from Shaler about the family where you enter into their home and everything is the language of the children are trashy and so forth. Hildebrand would certainly say a certain milieu is being formed here, but that's not what constitutes the community as a family. And so think of it this way. You have the classical communities, very specific structures, family, nation, culture, and so forth. And then you have communities in the broader sense of relationships and so forth, because certainly within the community of the family, you also have communities of relationships. And that's where I think you would say, yep, you have the character that's determined by values, we could say, from the ground up in a material way. I hope that did it. Okay.
We have time for one more question to Dr. Healy.
Hello, Michael.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
So 3 things, hopefully briefly. First, in the community of the church, one of the things that's unique compared to every other community, there's not the same equality of mine and yours, my family, your family, my nation, your nation, my state, because ultimately we're meant to be together in one church. So in a secondary sense, we can say my church and your church, but ultimately we're called to be one. Secondly, there's a great example, if you've ever seen it, at the end of the movie Major League, of how the subjectively satisfying brings people together. The Cleveland Indians finally beat the hated New York Yankees, and they show a scene in a bar where this rough and tumble blue-collar worker is next to a wild-haired hippie biker, and there's tension between them earlier. But when Cleveland beats the Yankees, they hug each other, and then they pull back like we're not supposed to be hugging. Then they hug each other again. See, the joy overcame the distance. Finally, I find it interesting how, I guess, certain shared experiences can make a collection into a community. And here I'm thinking of another movie, but it's based on a real-life event, and at the end of the movie they show the real people. The movie Sully, when the plane goes down in the Hudson River and everybody lives. And they really come together sort of as a community. Normally, passengers on a plane are just a collection, but they have reunions and give thanks, etc. So,
yeah. To your last point, Michael, it's interesting, and this is maybe because I don't know the text well enough. I'm puzzling over the question of whether in Hildebrand's work there is, as a principle of unity, just the fact of sharing an experience. Because you have values as unitive, but there's something to having undergone something together, or even just finding someone else who loves the same thing that you do. You could say that the value that you both love is unifying you, and maybe Hildebrand's right that that's all that's going on, but I'm wondering whether it's the fact that someone's with me in this. And I can't tell whether that's in Hildebrand's account or not, but maybe we could talk about it later or in between sessions for somebody who really knows the text better than I do. But I'm not sure that's in Hildebrand's work. But I think it could be an important dimension also to consider when it comes to the constitution of community, at least one element, if not sufficient for a community in the narrow sense.
Thank you very much, Maria.
Thank you.